Okay.
Hello, and welcome to episode 17 of Charlotte Mecklenburg History with Dan Morrill. Today is July 5th, 2020, Sunday, and I am Dan's daughter, Mary Dana, and I'm here with Dan through Zoom today. Hey, Dad. We are
Hey, everybody. Hey, Mary Dana. It's a real pleasure.
we are continuing our discussion of the Myers Park and Cherry neighborhoods. This is part 2. I think there's going to be a part 3. Isn't that right, Dad? You said you
I
probably
don't
can't
know.
get.
Maybe I'm riding this horse too long, but we'll see.
All right, we'll see what we get through.
Yeah.
So, okay. And so I see, Dad, you have the cover page. And I noticed you put my name on the cover page, but I did no work to prepare this presentation
What
at
you do,
all.
you edit, you post, you record. You're an equal partner.
Okay, well, that's nice of you to say. I don't know about that. But um, all right, so I will just let you go ahead and get started.
Well, I'm going to start with the same thing I did last time. If you want to know about Myers Park, read Legacy. It's a great book. I don't claim to be all knowledgeable, so I just wanted to say that. Now, last time I talked about John Springs Myers and the first Myers Park, which I think you remember really we think started about 1901. In fact, we know it was starting in 1901.
Yeah, we saw the newspaper ad.
But, there were relatively few houses in what we now know as Myers Park. There are more houses in Cherry than there were in Myers Park. And the vast majority of the 1,100 acres that John Springs Myers owned was treeless cotton farms. Now, I've got two individuals I think that's really the best place to start talking about Myers Park. I've talked about Daniel Augustus Tompkins before. Many people would find his views on many issues very disturbing today. But he was a profoundly influential person in really sort of stimulating the cotton industry here. And even more than that, he bought the Charlotte Observer. And the Charlotte Observer became a sort of trumpet for what was called the New South. That was a diversified, agricultural and industrial South. And Tompkins was really someone who really wanted Charlotte to be a very, very prominent place. He was like John Springs Myers. You remember John Springs Myers wanted Charlotte to be a consequential place. The same was true of Tompkins. And he was determined that Charlotte should have a public park. And we talked about Independence Park before.
Yes.
And he got the Charlotte City Council, or what was then the Board of Aldermen, to create the Charlotte Parks and Tree Commission to really promote what became Independence Park. And the other principal member of the Charlotte Parks and Tree Commission was George Stevens. Now, we've mentioned Stevens before. He was really the man who inspired Edward Colville Griffith when we were talking about Eastover.
Mm-hmm.
Stevens, I could go on and on about both these guys, but George Stevens, he grew up in Greensboro. He was an only child. His father died when Stevens was very young. His mother really reared him. He went to Oak Ridge Academy, which is in western Guilford County, near Kernersville, North Carolina. He went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He was a superb athlete, great left-handed pitcher, and allegedly he threw the first forward pass that was ever passed in a college football game. But George Stevens came here in the late 1890s, and the reason he moved here, his principal research paper when he was at Chapel Hill was on good roads. There was a big movement in North Carolina in the late 1800s and early 1900s to have good roads. And he saw that Mecklenburg County had good roads, and so he moved to Mecklenburg County when he graduated. He was first in the insurance business. He did some development that I'm going to sort of give you an illustration of. This is the Sunnyside Rose Garden, which no longer exists. It was in Piedmont Park, which is the first suburb that George Stevens actually developed. And that's sort of, he married Sophie Myers, who was the daughter of John Springs Myers. And so George Stevens sort of absorbed from his father-in-law that sort of love for beauty and development. And his first development really was Piedmont Park. And he also became a very important banker. In fact, he joined with one of his friends to establish what's now the Bank of America. It was really originally known as the American Trust Company. But George Stevens was a real doer. But he had that same vision of his father-in-law and of Dan Tompkins to really make Charlotte a very special place. And they, Tompkins and Stevens, said, where are we going to get the best person to design our first public park, Independence Park? They said, well, let's contact the faculty at Harvard. I mean, how much better can you get than Harvard? And so they contacted Harvard, and they had a student in landscape architecture. They said had never had any work, but he was really talented, and his name was John Nolan. Now, this was in 1905. Now, you can see that in 1905, Nolan was no longer a child. He had had a career before he started studying architecture, landscape architecture. And John Nolan had been very much influenced by going to Europe and seeing how European cities were put together and how dramatic they were. And he became part of what was known as the City Beautiful movement. Some people see Nolan as the man who really founded city planning. I mean, we'll talk about that when we get into Myers Park.
So he was about
He
35. He was about 35.
Yeah, he was not a kid by any means. He did design Independence Park. This is one of the features in Independence Park. And you can see here, one of the things that he was very, very devoted to was the use of stone. Because stone is the most durable, natural material that human beings can build with. And so he was very, very drawn to stone. And you can see the stone walkway, stone steps that still are a part of Independence Park. Well, Stevens got to know Nolan, and Nolan was not only an excellent landscape architect, he was a really good speaker. And he and Stevens established a relationship, and Nolan came back to Charlotte between 1905 and 1911, and he would give lectures. And you can see here's a newspaper from April 1907, said John Nolan, landscape architect, deliver an important illustrated address at Academy. Now that's the Academy of Music that used to be on Trine Street. And he had a very early slide machine, lantern slides. And he would give these lantern slide lectures where he'd illustrate his basic concept that when you designed a place for human beings to live, they should be beautiful, they should be uplifting, and they should be comprehensive in terms of their design. And by the way, Stevens was so taken with Nolan's lectures that through the American Trust Company, he set up a system of giving awards to people for their beautiful yards. So Stevens was, I don't know if the word mesmerized is exactly right, but he became absolutely captivated by John Nolan. One of the places that was designed by Nolan, and Stevens had him do it, is Canoga. Now, a lot of people know Canoga now as an Episcopal retreat south of Asheville. But Stevens established the original Canoga, which was pretty much wiped out by a flood in 1916. But he established the original Canoga to be a place for people of means and intellectual capacity to gather. It was much like Montreat, the way that for what Montreat was originally designed. But the reason I'm showing you this is Stevens became really fascinated with John Nolan. Now we come to Myers Park. Now, I'm going to get a little bit nerdy here, but so be it.
You're always
Now,
nerdy.
that's right. I can't help it.
That's okay.
Now, you remember there was the first Myers Park in 1901.
Yes.
The second Myers Park opens in 1912, and Nolan was hired in 1911 to design Myers Park. And it was really Nolan's first major job. And throughout his entire career, and Nolan has an illustrious career, he designed neighborhoods and towns all over the country. Irving Park, which is in Greensboro. Many people in Greensboro know about Irving Park. It's still very, very fashionable. Was designed by John Nolan. And there are people that I've gotten calls from all over the country who are captivated by Nolan's concepts of design. And he's very much revered and honored by people in landscape architecture to this very day.
Mm-hmm.
So let me tell you, Nolan said in essence that he wanted the Myers Park to be absolutely the best that you could build to provide a sense of uplifting for humankind. Now, we're going to see that one of the things he did was use a lot of rock, because again, rock denotes solidity. It denotes permanence. He was also determined, and we'll see this later, he was absolutely determined that he was going to transform essentially a treeless cotton farm into a forest, because he wanted the streets of Myers Park, including its principal major thoroughfare, which was named Queens Road, and we'll talk in a few minutes about why it was named Queens Road. He wanted Queens Road to be almost like a cathedral, where you would come down the street and you would just be surrounded by rows of majestic trees. Now,
Creating
remember,
to create like an archway.
that's
You
right.
mean sort of like that?
And of course, we saw the same thing on Colville Road in Eastover, because we'll see in a moment, Earl Sumner Draper worked for Nolan. So you see that same thing carried on. Now, let me tell you, I'll be a little bit philosophical. Remember that Myers Park, even though it's been bruised, and it has been bruised, you know, it is still a very, very fashionable neighborhood.
Why has it been bruised? You mean a lot of the original houses have been torn
No, I
down?
mean, it's still a fashionable neighborhood. It's still desired It's still a wonderful place to live. It's still looked upon. You know, when people think about Charlotte, they think about Myers Park. I mean, it's a special place.
I didn't know what you
Well,
meant by being bruised. Though.
well, we'll talk about that.
Oh.
It's,
By
it's,
the way,
it's
you've been talking for 15 minutes. You told me to let you know.
oh, gee, it's impossible. Well, now, no one. I'm not going to get through, and
I
I'm
know.
not
I
going to
see
worry about.
part
We'll have a
3
part
coming.
3. We'll have a part 3.
Okay.
One of the things that is so important in any design is a sense of arrival and a sense of departure. Spaces are made much more special when they have an edge. Now remember, this neighborhood was totally streetcar dependent, okay? Because there were very few automobiles here in 1911, 1912. There were some, but you had to have a streetcar, no doubt about it. Now, here we can see the entryway, which was really sort of the signature point with the waiting stations on each side, streetcar down the middle. Here you can see the waiting stations here. This is the actuality. And I'll have some later pictures of this gateway. But that was a very principal element in
Did
the.
Nolan do that drawing? That
Oh,
top drawing?
absolutely. Oh,
Okay, so
absolutely.
that was Nolan's
Oh, absolutely.
concept
Oh,
drawing.
I mean, and that's a fundamental idea, this sense of arrival. There you can see the 2 waiting stations real clearly, and you can see the archway entrance with the streetcar went through it. And this is, of course, at the corner of 4th and Hawthorne. That's where it is.
The
Now,
waiting stations are still there,
they are,
right?
and we'll see them later.
Okay.
Right. Streetcar. I mean, there's the conductor and the motorman. You had a 2-person crew on a streetcar. Now, you can see now this waiting station not only did you have them at the entrance, but you had waiting stations along Queens Road, and one on Queens Road, an original, still survives. This is the corner of Hermitage and Queens Road. And that was, again, use of stone, and you can see the kind of very, very distinctive architectural style that was being reinforced there. Now, these are the entry gates at Hermitage Court, which was developed by the Simmons Company. It was not the same, but Nolan, they cooperated, and Nolan he did the design for Hermitage Court. So Hermitage Court's never been technically originally part of Myers Park, but it was a very sympathetic type development. And Nolan did design it. And you can see the stone gateways. I mean, that's what, that was so much what he was about. So now here is one of the very earliest houses. This is the John Jameson House, 802 Providence Road. And it was built in 1913. It's one of the very, very first houses, designed, by the way, by Louis Asbury Sr. You might remember that we ran into him in Eastover. And he was a very, very prominent architect. By the way, there's tragedy associated with this. The man who built this house never got to live in it because he was killed when he got hit by a train in Newell, right near what's now UNCC, a tragic accident.
That is sad.
Now, this is a wonderful example of an adaptive reuse. This is now used as a bank.
Yeah.
But you can see that the house is stone. Yes. Again, that stone element. Now, I wanted to show you a couple. Now, this, you not only had that sort of rectilinear style, that very subdued sort of blockish style that you saw with the Jameson House. There were earlier examples of colonial revival too. Now, this was the George Stevens House. It's at 802 Harvard Place. Harvard Place was named because John Nolan was educated at Harvard.
Oh, okay.
And this is exactly the same place where John Springs Myers' house had been.
Oh,
In
that was
other
the
words,
location.
George Steve, the same location. It's on the high ground. Except John Springs Myers' house used to face east. This house faces west. By the way, you know, you always run into tragedy in any human life. L.L. Hunter, the architect, committed suicide in 1925. So you always encounter it. Now, this is a very interesting neoclassical house, one of the very earliest houses. I have not researched it enough to know, but I think it was built about 1913. And it was built by the company by the family that developed Hermitage Court, the Simmons House. And this, if you go up Hermitage Road from Queens Road, turn left on Hermitage Court, it's the first house on the right. So there was a variety of architecture. Now, I've shown this photograph before. This is Earl Sumner Draper. He was brought by Nolan to Charlotte to be the on-site guy. He was the one who picked out the trees, the plantings. He did landscape plans. And by the way, they spent they were taking basically a treeless cotton farm and making it into a forest. And you can see the effort, the difficulty they went to, the technology that Draper and Nolan were doing. You know, a lot of people think that Myers Park has always been tree covered. That is definitely not the case. That is definitely not true. And you can see what they were doing and what they were going through to develop their. Now, this is what
Well,
they were
wait, and I
at.
want to say that they actually planted mature trees. I
Some,
see.
some, but most of them were like what you see here on
Okay.
Ardsley Road. Now, that somebody in our family has talked about this big white oak tree.
Yes,
See it now? That's
I
in the
see it.
original Myers Park. Remember the
Hmm.
original Myers Park?
Yes.
You're looking. There's a Duke. There's what becomes the Duke Mansion.
Okay.
Ardsley Road going up to Hermitage Road and on to Providence beyond. But see, that was the size of most of the trees that you saw.
Okay.
There
So
were
pretty
some
small.
trees that were there, but they filled in. Draper filled in these small trees on Ardsley Road to get that sort of cathedral effect that we were talking about.
Hmm.
Now, let me talk a little bit about this, and I know I'm probably going too long, but I'm going to take you
It's
down
fine.
a trip on Hermitage Road from Providence Road to Queens Road. Prior to this, all the streets in Charlotte, except for one example that we don't need to get into, a small example, had been grid patterned, straight streets intersecting straight streets. Nolan was a big fan of curvilinear streets. In other words, going down a street like Hermitage Road should be like going through a series of visual envelopes. Now, this is the same road, but it curves, it bends, it goes with the topography. And if you will, that's what you see when you go down Hermitage Road. It's not straight. It curves, it bends, and you
Yes.
remember
I've been
we
on it.
saw that so much in the original part of Eastover,
Mm-hmm.
because again, Draper picked up on that, you see. Now let me show you Edge Hill Park. Here's Edge Hill Park. Nolan truly was, first thing he would do, he would walk the land. Now, this is Edge Hill Park. Here is a creek going down here. See this creek?
Mm-hmm.
Now you'll see a lot of places, when they want to develop a neighborhood, they'll put a creek to separate the backyards of two houses. There'll be a house over here, be a house over here,
Yes.
and there'll be a creek between. And the creek, therefore, nobody can get to.
Mm-hmm.
What Nolan did was take the creek and make it basically the center of a park. And of course, Edge Hill Road, which runs along the edge of the road, gives that sense of experiencing the creek. So when you think about what Nolan did and what Nolan's mind was, it was respect for the landscape, respect for nature.
Mm-hmm.
Don't isolate creeks, celebrate creeks. And of course, in a sense, that's just really now. Here he is building Queens Road. Now you can see here what kind of a landscape he's dealing with.
Flat,
Wait, now look at
treeless.
this. Now let me
Flat
show
and
you
treeless.
Queens Road. See the poles going down the middle for the streetcar,
Mm-hmm.
and the tracks are going to be in the middle. Now I'll show you the same place today. Now see what he's doing in essence. People drive down that road and they think, well, it's always been that way. Well, it hadn't been that way.
Yeah, I
It
see
was
that.
it was strictly planned that way. Now, let me tell you something else. When you start down a road like Queens Road, first thing is you have a sense of beginning, and that gateway gave you a sense of beginning. But you also need, how are we doing time-wise?
27 minutes.
Okay. You have to have a sense of arrival. There has to be a destination. Now, Nolan persuaded a female academy, which had existed for decades in the center city on North College Street, to relocate to Myers Park, to change its name to Queens College. He did the design, Nolan did the design of the landscape. The buildings were designed by C.C. Hook. You might remember him on that fire station number 6 when we were doing Eastover.
Mm-hmm.
The college opened in 1914 at this new location. And of course, we all know it's still there today. I'll show you a nice little historic photograph of, one of the great things is you can tell cars.
Yeah.
And I just saw where Queens College had to change the name of the building because from Burwell Hall to Queens Hall, because Mr. Burwell owned some slaves. But I'm not going to get into that. Now, he also persuaded a military school that was in Oxford, North Carolina, in which had experienced a major fire, to move to Charlotte. And it was located where now the Myers Park Country Club is located, known as the Horner Military Academy. And it went there in 1914. So when you came to Queens Road and you went through the gate, you knew you were going to Queens College and you were going to the Horner Military School. And this building, I believe, now somebody could probably say, man, you don't know what you're talking about, you old man, you're getting senile, dementia is approaching. I believe this building was originally the barracks of the Horner Military Academy. And if you face what's now the Myers Park Country Club, this building was to the immediate right. And the original Myers Park Country Club actually took control of the Horner Military School because it closed in 1920. It was only there from 1914 to 1920. Now let me talk a little bit about the Myers Park Club, which was formed in 1921. After the Horner Military School closed, the club came. Nolan tried to get the Charlotte Country Club to move to Myers Park. That was his desire. He even built and seeded a golf course. Nobody played on it, but he seeded a golf course. Well, the Charlotte Country Club turned me down.
Okay.
And of course, we know the Charlotte Country Club is now over there in Colonial at Club Estates or Plaza Midwood, still over there on the northeast side of the city. When they didn't come, he got this Myers Park Country Club to form, and they, of course, there's their golf course, and this was 1923. And the man who designed an expansion of the golf course and really sort of put it together was a man named Donald Ross. Now, Donald Ross is a big name in golf club landscape planning. And the man who chose the plantings was our old friend, Earl Sumner Draper.
Mm-hmm.
How are we doing on time?
31 minutes.
Okay, I can give 5 minutes. I can get through this.
Yeah.
You asked the question, Myers Park was bruised.
Yeah.
I'll give you some examples. This on Queens Road. What's wrong with this, Mary Dana?
Well, it looks like a high rise with a parking deck.
See, the idea was the top of Myers Park should be the trees.
Oh.
The houses almost ought to be like Christmas ornaments hanging on the trees. Anything that breaks that tree line is destructive to the original plan.
Oh,
now that's on Queens Road. See, if you look, see here's what was to be Queens Road. This is what Nolan thought. See, trees, houses, and then you get that. What do you think of that, Mary Dana?
That's the Carlton, isn't it?
It is, and you know, there are fine people that live in the Carlton. I'm not trying to give anybody a hard time. I'm just saying that is very compromising to the original plan for Myers Park.
Right, that's what you meant. That's a bruise on the neighborhood.
Now, let's talk about this. We're back at the Gateway, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, now, that's a very, very dramatic, and, you know, I had somebody ask me, was that a guardhouse? Yeah, no, it wasn't a guardhouse. The trolley didn't stop. You give me a great. Everybody wants to think that, you know, Myers Park was gated. Anyway, but you can see that this was a very, very distinctive building, right? You see that basic architectural style that we talked about.
Well, what was it? What was it if it wasn't a guardhouse?
It was just a place to announce arrival and departure.
Okay.
See, that's the thing, is the edge of a space is so important. Mm-hmm. Well, the waiting stations are still there, right? But
well, it looks a lot different now.
What?
It looks a lot different. Different.
Well, do you have a sense of arrival at Myers Park?
No.
I mean, again, they basically took this down because they wanted a left-hand turn lane.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they took that down for a left turn lane. Give me a break.
Okay.
But I want to show you this. This really, you'll be interested in this. This is a map. I really tried to put areas. You see this red area?
Yes.
See that little thing right at the top of the red area?
Yes.
It's pointing toward? That's the guardhouse.
Okay.
All right. Now, until 1961, you got that right?
Okay.
Providence Road ended at Caswell.
Wow.
In other words, this is coming in from out of town, right?
Hmm.
You came down Providence to Caswell. You know where Caswell is.
Yes.
You had to turn right.
Mm.
You had to go up, turn left, and then you went into town that way, right?
Okay. Okay.
Now, in 1961, July 1961, let me tell you, me, Dana, highway engineers can drive you nuts,
Okay.
providing convenience for automobiles. They blew this out, and they came down with this connector, which we now call 3rd Street. So when you come down after 1961, you don't turn at Caswell anymore. You just go straight.
Right.
Now, I'm sure that a lot of people think it's always been that way. Well, look what it did. Here was the sense of arrival. You're entering Myers Park. They blow this up. They crunch it, right? I don't know when exactly it was torn down, but it was before this was put in. But then they put this thing in here.
Right.
Well, this completely isolates this part up here. So that the whole sense of arrival of the place was just totally compromised. So it was bruised. So, this is probably about where I'm going to end for today, but just give me a sense, man, Dana. I mean, come on. What do you think about? Would
You know,
you like to
I
have that? Would you like to have that today?
I did not realize that 3rd Street didn't used to cut through to uptown. That's a surprise to me to know that. So I never, I knew that those trolley stations were the waiting stations were there, but honestly, I never knew until today that they were really meant to be this grand entrance into Myers Park onto Queens Road that went down that way, because I've always known it as broken up by how 3rd Street cuts across Queens. So
In fact, the
it's really
Landmarks
surprising.
Commission, they wanted to tear this one down,
Sure, I see it's kind of in
but
the way.
we made them. They're building some big thing for. I think it's a heart cancer
Uh-huh.
center. Uh, uh, Presbyterian Hospital or whatever they call
Sure.
it now. And we were able to save it. But you're absolutely right. That was a tremendous.
That really changed the landscape, and
Oh,
that was before
absolutely.
my time. You were here.
Absolutely. Well, when I first came to Charlotte to date your mother, which was in 1956, fall 1956. And I came to Charlotte to see your mother a lot in 57, 58. It hadn't been changed.
Right.
It was in July 61 when I was in graduate school at Emory, but my goodness. And you know why it was done?
Traffic flow. Improve traffic flow to
Exactly.
uptown.
Exactly.
I
Why
know.
don't we all go and why don't we all put a big automobile sign up and worship to it? Ah, bah, bah,
No.
bah. Ah, bah, bah, bah.
Okay. Well, on that note, I think, is this the end of part 2? You'll have to do
It
part
is.
3
We'll do a part 3.
next week.
I'll show
Okay.
you some more stuff about Myers Park. I got a lot more to show you.
Okay. So please join us next week for part 3. And thanks so much for being with us today. And I'll see you next week.
Oh,
Dad,
I've
good.
enjoyed being with you. Bye
Okay.
bye.
Me too. Bye.